Hello, and welcome back again. In the last video, we discussed a problem in Advaita Vedanta, which is the tension between the idea of an inconceivable, attributeless, and unchanging absolute being, and the idea of a conceivable, attribute-full, and changing world. Since the attribute-full is not the attribute-less, then the attribute-full, the world, must ultimately be unreal if the only reality is attribute-less. We explained there that if the Advaitin Absolute was not in fact pure being as opposed to pure non-being, but rather transcendent to both, then the tension is resolved. Basically, Brahman is a positive language expression of something that is neither positive nor negative. In this video, we'll be discussing a complementary problem in Buddhism, which is that emptiness is a negative language expression of something that is, again, neither positive nor negative. As in the previous video, this is not necessarily a doctrinal problem with the broader tradition itself, but a problem in how the teachings may be interpreted, and indeed have been interpreted in some of its schools. For example, in the Prasangika strand of Madhyamaka, epitomized by the Tibetan master Tsongkhapa and his Rang Tong doctrine, emptiness is treated as a purely non-affirming negation, where positive language expression is inadmissible. Again, I must emphasize that the problem is not that this teaching is wrong, simply that it is incomplete and potentially misleading. Enjoy. If we want to talk about what is para-philosophy, we have no choice but to dress it in concepts, and so there is a difference between talking about what is beyond philosophy and actually recognizing or abiding in non-conceptual experience. There is a difference between the finger that points and that which it points to. We must understand, therefore, that in order to make that which is beyond perspective into something we can point to, for the benefit of students and seekers, we must introduce a certain level of bias. And to do this, we can lean towards a more affirmative characterization or towards a more negative characterization. We can describe what it's like experientially, or we can describe what it's not like intellectually. We can understand the intention of Vedanta in taking the former option to be a result of its distinctly religious and devotional historical context. We are not therefore making criticism of this context, but are rather highlighting that there is another context that will be more appropriate for a different class of people, and in this we will find the essential difference between Vedanta and Buddhism. So, just as previously we explained the limitations with the positive characterization of the ultimate principle in Vedanta, in this video we'll discuss the limitations with the most negative approach of Buddhism. By the end of this video, we will have bridged the gap between fullness and emptiness without directly contradicting the principles of either tradition. We will understand that these two very different approaches are not contradictory because the ultimate principle does not discriminate between opposites. It is our own minds that do the discriminating, and it is the collision between the principle of non-duality, which describes reality objectively, and the principle of duality, which describes reality subjectively, which generates the paradox of the absolute. Non-duality cannot be thought of as non-duality. It can only be thought of as a unity of opposites. Ultimately, there are no opposites. Relatively, the opposites are one. So, to begin, it is maintained in the Advaita tradition that Brahman is beyond all characterization and labels, and this implies that Brahman must be related to para-philosophy and the parajective, being that which is beyond all particular philosophies and perspectives. Indeed, the true nature of Brahman is said to be nirguna, or attributeless. However, Brahman is also described as Sat Chitananda, existence, consciousness, bliss, and these sound a lot like attributes. We must then question whether these are not in fact attributes of Brahman itself, but are rather necessary conditions for the possibility of liberation, a bit like the descriptions of luminosity we find in Buddhism. That is, Are they pedagogical tools that express the subjective experience of Brahman as a negation of the extremes of non-existence, unconsciousness, and suffering? Since we cannot grasp the ultimate reality as it is in itself, devoid of our own subjectivity, these tools are justified to enable the student to begin on their path, though they are to be ultimately abandoned upon the non-dual realization. We have, however, done enough in discussing this problem in the previous video, and it would be unfair of us to stretch the concept of Brahman to fit a Buddhist narrative. Again, Hinduism generally is a distinctly spiritualistic and devotional tradition, while Buddhism, particularly Madhyamaka, has taken a more critical approach in directing its followers towards the non-dual insight. We should therefore recognize that the Vedantins have understood something important within their own context, and we should now work in the opposite direction to understand critically if there is any way at all of understanding emptiness more positively. The first thing to consider is that the whole point of Nagarjuna's Catuskoti, or fourfold negation, is to show that philosophical discourse always operates at the level of conventional or relative truth, and can never be applied to the ultimate nature of things. We can, however, understand the ultimate nature of things by understanding the interdependent nature of conventional reality, and so emptiness here is simply the fact that the conventional is not ultimately real. Objects do not have intrinsic existence, and concepts do not have ultimate truth. This is not to say that things are ultimately or absolutely non-existent, it is to say that they are not absolutely existent. This is in many ways similar to Shankara's doctrine of Maya, the difference being that the Buddhists do not assert a more fundamental, noumenal reality beneath the empirical existence of the world, and so the world itself is not an illusion. Emptiness is the negation of the conceptual content of our experience. While we understand that emptiness is not a statement about the nature or existence of ultimate reality, it's also not a statement about its non-existence. Otherwise, Madhyamaka would be nihilism. The entire point of Nagarjuna's method is precisely to not make statements about the ultimate reality, because he sees such statements as barriers to spiritual realization. If he did make statements about the ultimate reality, then it would have to be using philosophical concepts, and these concepts would have to be negated regardless to remain consistent with his method of negating all conceptual content. Nagarjuna does not offer a thesis of his own, but rather refutes those of others. Again, he is very clear in expressing that the criticism of all views should not be taken itself as a view, and the rejection of all theories is not itself a theory, or at least it's not a theory that is immune to its own rejection. But it is understandable why many of Nagarjuna's interlocutors have interpreted his method as a kind of view, a nihilistic view, because his silence can easily be misinterpreted as a denial of reality. There is even a sense in which this is not just a misinterpretation, because if you reject all views, then you are more clearly expressing to those who do not already understand you that any assertion of ultimate truth is false, and less clearly that any rejection of ultimate truth is equally false. The value of the method is to help others understand. It's not just on other people to interpret you correctly, it's on you to ensure that you cannot be misinterpreted. Since all philosophical positions are to be negated, it must be the case that the reality is ultimately beyond both the affirmation and rejection of both the notions that it exists and that it does not exist, and indeed both and neither. This is the so-called ninth view of the Catuskoti, the viewless view, which clearly hints towards a more positive dimension of emptiness. If it did not, then there would ultimately be nothing, and there would also be no possibility of liberation. This ineffable and indeterminate suchness is conveyed in the Mahayana scriptures with the term tathata, which is related to the fact that, in spite of the absence of intrinsic existence, still things appear as the world. To understand suchness is simply to see things as they are, beyond all conceptualization and mental projection. To abide in this state of immediacy, attachments to things become dissolved, and we enter the state of nirvana, which is not merely the extinguishing of attachments, but a positive state of bliss. Emptiness should not therefore be understood as merely the negation of everything, but also as the relativity of objects and concepts. As we know, emptiness, sunyata, is identified with dependent origination, pratityasamutpada, because from the perspective of non-dual wisdom, the relative and the ultimate are one. When considered from the relative empirical standpoint, emptiness is the absence of intrinsic existence in all things, while from the ultimate, non-dual standpoint, emptiness is the absence of all the dualistic categories of thought, the Catuskoti, or the dialectical matrix. It is simply that the absence of thought is obviously not something you can intellectualize, and so for us to assert that emptiness is reality without intellectualization, we have already entered the domain of relativity, in which the statement is ultimately untrue, because no relative statements are ultimately true. It is therefore natural that we find in later traditions of Buddhism, particularly East Asian traditions like Huayan and Chan or Zen, that emptiness and suchness are interpreted as non-dual luminous awareness. For instance, in the treatise Awakening of Faith in the Mahayana, which influenced both of these schools, it is said, "In its very origin, suchness is of itself endowed with sublime attributes. It manifests the highest wisdom which shines throughout the world. It has true knowledge and a mind resting simply in its own being. It is eternal, blissful, its own self-being, and the purest simplicity. It is invigorating, immutable, free. Because it possesses all these attributes and is deprived of nothing, it is designated both as the womb of the tathata, which is the Buddha nature or the innate potential for enlightenment, and the truth body of the tathagata, the embodiment of truth, which is sometimes spoken of as a kind of universal enlightened awareness. Other traditions go even further than this, explicitly associating the Dharmakaya, this universal enlightened awareness, with the Vedic Atman. We find this in Dolpopa's Shentong doctrine in Tibetan Buddhism, and more recently in the Dharmakaya movement in Thailand. These traditions teach that while all relative, empirical, and conceptual phenomena are empty of intrinsic existence or self-being, the ultimate reality of the Dharmakaya is not. Indeed, it is full of its own awakened qualities. These examples, of course, are highly controversial and contradict the doctrine of anatta, or no self, which is considered fundamental to Buddhism. Now, the dialectical matrix of paraphilosophy has the same structure as the Catuskoti of Nagarjuna. The latter is principally a logical system, while the former is much more general, but both reveal that our views are fragments of our ability to conceive of the truth, and cannot in themselves be ultimately true. This does not mean, however, that nothing is ultimate, but that truth, falsity, both, and neither are relative notions which cannot be ascribed to the ultimate nature of things. I must assume that Nagarjuna did have something positive in mind with regard to the concept of emptiness, beyond his purely deconstructive and negative critical philosophy. The critique is designed to treat the ultimate reality in a way that is intellectually justifiable, and so he cannot, with his method, ascribe to it concepts that are ultimately invalid. The point is not to have, and not encourage, views on the ultimate reality, because it is of the utmost importance that we do not mistake any view with non-dual wisdom, which is beyond all concepts. In the remainder of this video, therefore, we shall be exploring in some depth the following hypothesis. If we view Brahman as totally nirguna, transcending all attributes, including that of substantiality and absolute existence, and if we consider emptiness as embodying the potential for the relative existence of all phenomena through the principle of interdependence, and thus also the potential for enlightenment, then can we see both to be reflecting different aspects of a singular, ineffable suchness, which we can refer to as paraphilosophy. Calling this thing a self is going too far, and calling it no self isn't far enough. But what it is the freedom required for the possibility of anything. To begin, Let us remember that Nagarjuna tells us that everything depends on everything else, and so nothing is self-caused or intrinsically existent. The ultimate truth, for Nagarjuna, is the truth of emptiness, which is precisely the universal lack of intrinsic existence. But Nagarjuna wants to avoid the claim that emptiness itself can be thought of as an intrinsically existent thing, and so he further claims that emptiness itself is empty of intrinsic existence. So, emptiness is not an independent thing, it has meaning only as a negative feature of conditioned things that arise interdependently. Without interdependence, there would be no emptiness, as there would be nothing that was empty, and emptiness does not exist in the absence of things that are empty. Emptiness is itself empty. And we should note here that when Madhyamaka says that the absence of intrinsic existence does not have intrinsic existence, it's not using a classical bivalent negation, because classical bivalent negations are implicative, while the Catuskoti is non-implicative. It neither affirms nor denies, nor both, nor neither. The Catuskoti dissolves the conceptual basis for making a determination about whether emptiness has or does not have the characteristic of lacking intrinsic existence. To say that emptiness is empty means that emptiness is not existent, non-existent, both, nor neither. It is not something that could have such qualities in principle. So, emptiness is not a void, but the void of a void. It is also absent of being absent from phenomena. The idea here is to dissolve dualistic notions like being versus non-being by revealing the non-duality between the truth of emptiness and the truth of interdependent arising. The absence of intrinsic existence, or independence, is not different from the presence of extrinsic existence, or interdependence. Or in other words, the absence of independence implies the presence of interdependence. There is no real distinction between emptiness and the relational presence of everything that does indeed exist. These are two ways of understanding one and the same reality. And if emptiness is the relative existence of phenomena, then in a conventional sense, we can indeed say that emptiness has the characteristic of being empty. That is, dependently originated phenomena have the characteristic of being empty. I think it is precisely in this sense that Yogacara asserts that it is consciousness which is empty, that consciousness is the appearance of emptiness, since phenomena are simply transformations of consciousness. Nagarjuna is simply making sure that we do not take this as an ultimate thing, because ultimately there is no difference between appearances and emptiness. The idea that appearances have the characteristic of being empty because they arise interdependently makes it sound like emptiness and dependent arising are two different things, that one is a consequence or feature of the other. But really, to say that appearances arise interdependently is exactly the same thing as saying that they are empty. It's just a tautology. That is, to say that something has the characteristic of being empty because it is dependently originated is just to say that something is empty because it's empty. And so, if everything is simply emptiness appearing, then the characteristic of being empty is not a contingent property of things, but their fundamental nature. And what Nagarjuna is getting at in all this is that while we can make an epistemological distinction between an ultimate and a relative understanding of appearances, that is, between emptiness and dependent origination, we cannot make an ontological distinction between them. There is no separate emptiness apart from appearances. There are two ways of intellectually connecting to and rationalizing reality, but there are not two different realities. Enlightenment is the removal of delusion, not the accessing of a new reality. The key insight here is that it is the mind, the knower and the thinker and the rationalizer, which introduces duality and separation and delusion and indeed suffering, while the state of pure experience, without conceptual reflection, finds no such duality, just reality. The epistemological distinction between emptiness and dependent origination is itself the delusion we must overcome. So there is just this appearance, and this appearance is characterized by the interdependence of its apparently component parts, with nothing existing without everything else. Reality is not a collection of separate things, but an indivisible field of interdependent arising. Every change that appears to come into or go out of existence is merely an appearance of this glowing network of interdependence. Everything that happens to everything, and the nature of all things is their relation to everything else, which is precisely their emptiness. The early Buddhist schools and the Abhidharma tradition interpreted this as a kind of realistic pluralism, where dhammas refer to discrete momentary appearances. But these are just appearances. Causality is not an interaction between separate entities, but the unfolding of interdependent relations in a seamless process. Dependent origination is just emptiness appearing, and when viewed in this way, all distinctions dissolve into a dynamic immediacy, referred to in the Mahayana as tathata, or suchness. There is no actual interdependent multiplicity, but just the appearance of multiplicity. Multiplicity and unity are not opposites, but two perspectives on the same seamless arising. Suchness thus refers to reality free from the conceptual impositions that create the illusion of separateness. It is an understanding of interconnectedness as the presence of interdependence, rather than as the absence of independence. Suchness is the non-duality of emptiness and dependent arising. The suchness of appearance is not dependent on anything external to itself, because there is no outside to suchness. It is not a thing among things, but just the way reality is. Indeed, some Mahayana scriptures describe suchness as unconditioned, unborn, and unchanging. Of course, Madhyamaka wants to avoid this kind of language because calling suchness independent makes it sound like it has inherent existence. But we know that emptiness is not an attribute added onto things, but is rather their very mode of conventional being. It is not that things exist and happen to be empty, there is just emptiness appearing. Emptiness is the nature of appearance, and nature is the appearance of emptiness, which can also be called suchness. To deny this would be to falsely assume that emptiness and appearance are two different things that depend on each other, when in fact they are not. So, if suchness does not depend on anything beyond itself, if it's not caused or conditioned, then in that sense we can call it independent. Sure, we can also make an argument as to why it is a false conceptual imposition to call it independent, but we can at least accept that there is a weak affirmation in the recognition that suchness is not a dependent phenomenon. Duality is the delusion we must overcome. Dependence is not ultimately a relation between separate things, but the intrinsic openness of reality, where appearance and emptiness arise as two aspects of the same dynamic. And since emptiness and appearance are not two things, appearance must be empty, and emptiness must appear. This is an ontological necessity, and so emptiness cannot be merely the absence of intrinsic existence, it must be the intrinsic freedom that allows for the manifestation of all appearances. Indeed, this freedom must literally be appearance. So, at the ultimate level of analysis, emptiness is non-dependent. But this non-dependence does not equal intrinsic existence as a kind of extreme. Non-dependence simply means that it does not depend on anything outside of itself. Again, emptiness is interdependence, is suchness. And while each appearance depends on every other appearance, the suchness in which all distinctions have dissolved does not depend on anything. Non-dependence is, in this sense, the openness that allows for spontaneous self-arising. The mere existence of appearances does not depend on a static essence that exists outside themselves, it is simply spontaneous self-arising. The total denial of emptiness as inherently existent is based on a faulty and outdated notion of existence as a static essence, which is a historical artifact of ancient Indian thought. It is quite understandable why Nagarjuna was so keen to refute this notion of existence, but the truth remains that existence has never been static. It is dynamic, relational, and self-arising. Again, there is not just nothing. There must be a valid, non-absolutist notion of existence as the proper description of that which appears. Reality is not an expression of absolute existence, nor absolute non-existence. It's the middle way between them. So, when we use the term existence in a way that corresponds to reality, we are not referring to a static essence or the extreme view of essentialism. We are referring to something that is neither absolutely existent nor absolutely non-existent. By freeing existence from this mistaken assumption, we eliminate the contradiction between inherent existence and the middle way. After all, if extremes are to be rejected, then what those extremes sought to explain, that is, the nature of existence, must actually be accounted for by the middle. Thus, existence is not a fixed essence, but the dynamic self-revelation of reality, the non-dependent presence of interdependence itself. So, the nature of interdependence is the emptiness of all the things that interdependently appear, and the mere fact of the interdependence of all things, their suchness, does not depend on anything. It is spontaneously self-arising. Non-dependence is not intrinsic existence in the sense of being a static essence underlying phenomena, but is simply the interdependent presence of phenomena themselves. In other words, the kind of intrinsic existence and self-nature that the suchness of appearance has is simply the expression of interdependence itself. It is nothing other than the extrinsic existence and emptiness of all things. It is nothing other than the openness in which emptiness and appearance arise as two inseparable aspects of the same dynamic suchness. And I'm trying to be very careful here that I don't contradict the orthodox view of Madhyamaka. I'm just trying to say what its own method necessarily leaves unsaid. Ultimately, suchness cannot be spoken of with concepts. Calling it dependent is a conceptual imposition, and calling it independent is a conceptual imposition. The point of this exercise is not at all to say that it is false to call suchness dependent and true to call it independent. The point is to express that if we do use words, which we have to do in order to communicate, then there are two complementary approaches we can take to describe suchness. We can take the more orthodox Madhyamaka approach, or we can take a more positive approach, which is reminiscent of the tradition developed from Yogacara. These two approaches, one emphasizing absence, the other expressing presence, are not contradictory, but complementary ways of articulating the same ineffable reality. Negation clears away misconceptions, while affirmation allows for a direct engagement with the lived reality of suchness. And according to this latter approach, there is a valid notion of non-dependence, and arguably even intrinsic existence and self-nature, but its meaning is nothing other than interdependence and extrinsic existence and other nature. While this is a conceptual elaboration, it is clearly pointing beyond concepts, because it recognizes that the ultimate truth is characterized by a total breakdown of the opposites we usually employ to describe our experience, a breakdown in the only tool we have to figure all this complicated deep stuff out. You can say that this approach is self-defeating because it defines something in terms of its opposite, and that's fair enough, but that's also precisely the point. It is the only way to express a reality that transcends conceptual opposites, because to define something without reference to its opposite is already to assume a conceptual boundary that does not ultimately exist. There can be no concepts in a true understanding, because the opposites have become one, and if they've become one, then they've become none. I would like to suggest, then, that there is a defendable notion of self in Buddhism, but its nature is the lack of self. This is similar to a claim I've made elsewhere on this channel, that the ultimate truth is that there is no ultimate truth. This was never to say that there actually is no ultimate truth, it's to say that there isn't even not one. That the very framework of affirmation and negation is a conceptual imposition to be transcended. Our ability to distinguish between the idea that an absolute exists or does not exist, that a self exists or does not, must overcome itself in order to reconnect with the immediacy of experience beyond all concepts. The ultimate point is not to resolve a logical contradiction, but to get out of our heads and return to the immediacy of experience, where the opposition of self and no-self dissolves on its own. You see, at the very basis of ontology, we have two concepts of being. On the one hand, we have the idea of substance, and this is naturally related to the idea of independent existence and intrinsic self-nature. This is the idea most philosophers throughout history have taken as to the fundamental constituents of reality, that everything is reducible to some basic stuff. And on the other hand, we have the idea of process, that the basis of all things is movement and change. This idea was held by Heraclitus and by Alfred North Whitehead. But these two concepts are merely two perspectives on one and the same reality. There is a sense in which there is an ultimate substance from which all things are composed, but the very fabric of this substance is process. It is simply that what we usually think of by substance was never valid to begin with. Substance is how process appears when conceptualized statically, but in reality, substance itself is nothing other than dynamic process. The nature of unity is difference. The nature of permanence is change. So long as we retain a conceptual duality between the ultimate and the relative, we cannot truly recognize the essence of non-duality, even if we understand that there is no ontological duality between self and other. The key is not to recognize your unity with the world. This is a nice idea, but it's still too intellectual. It's still reinforcing the illusion of a subject grasping an object. And it's also what leads awakened people to start acting like they're God or a saint, which is obviously to miss the point entirely. The key is to recognize that the distinction between being separate from the world and being unified with the world, between delusion and wisdom, self and no self, illusion and reality, that is itself the illusion. The difference is the very essence of intellectual thought, and thus it is only a product of the mind. Even delusion and illusion are non-dual with awareness, and thus they are already enlightened experiences. There are only enlightened experiences. Delusion is just something that primordially enlightened awareness appears as, since awareness does not interfere with its own transformations. When the illusion recognizes itself as illusion, it dissolves. When it does not, it is perpetuated. But awareness itself never intervenes because it is not a self. But if by self, what we intend to point towards is the open, boundless, luminous capacity for experience that is not fixed, not graspable, not other than what is right now, the self whose self-nature is selfless, then I don't think this is incompatible with Buddhism. And that's it. Now, I ended up rewriting this video multiple times because there's just so many different ways you can approach this topic. In the end, I tried to stay as close as possible to orthodox Madhyamaka teachings, but if we allow ourselves to be a bit more flexible with language, there is more that can be said. So, you'll probably hear me coming back to this topic at a later time, once a bit more groundwork has been laid to ensure I won't mislead you. See you again soon.